Welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilled life possible. On February 2nd, which is the birthday of novelist and philosopher Ayn Rand, I spoke with my friend Timothy Sandefur about his latest book, Freedom's Furies: How Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand Found Liberty in an Age of Darkness. It was a really fun conversation. We touched on literary history, political history, economic history. We talked about what the Furies would think of today's world, what they would think are the most pressing issues today. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Timothy Sandefur. I hope you enjoy it.
This might sound like kind of a flippant question, but it's not meant to be. I think it's a question that a lot of people will approach this topic with. I mean, you are a constitutional lawyer. You're a busy guy. You've written, I think, like 8 or 9 other books, and you've taken some time out of your life to write about Ayn Rand. Sorry, we're talking about Freedom's Furies today. You took your time to write this book about Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane, and Ayn Rand. Why? Why do these figures matter today?
Well, I think their ideas are profoundly important. Their ideas about freedom, about morality, about how to live our lives, and what sort of society we should have, and what sort of government we should have to, protect our rights to live our lives freely. I think those are profoundly important, and those obviously closely relate to my work as a constitutional lawyer, trying to vindicate the freedoms that are promised to us by the Constitution. But the broader answer is because I find them fascinating people, and I've always loved intellectual history and how people figured things out and learned from each other, and the ideas that I've often joked I would like someday to write a newspaper column called "Brilliant Wrong Ideas," because I'm fascinated by clever theories that aren't right, like Aristotle's theory of how gravity works and things like this. So I've just always been interested in ideas to begin with. Also, these personalities are so fascinating. I actually started out, when I was going to do this project, started out to write a biography of Rose Wilder Lane, because I've just always found her such an intriguing figure. But that's been done before, and I decided that instead what I'd try to do is focus on this really interesting fact that in 1943, all 3 of these women published books that sort of began the free market individualist movement, or at least restarted it in the United States. And it turns out that they knew each other. They had very similar influences, and they worked together in some interesting ways. And so that it kind of took off from there.
Yeah, there's this strange confluence of things that brought these 3 together. Could you give us an idea? Maybe we could go just get a glimpse of the biographies of each, starting with Isabel Patterson.
Yeah, Patterson was born in 1886 on a tiny island on the north side of Lake Huron, and she grew up on the American frontier. Her family moved around in her youth, and she witnessed the end of the pioneer era. She saw the railroads being constructed to the west. She remembered seeing her first light bulb. She was 16 years old and she saw her first light bulb. She remembered when the Wright brothers flew the first airplane at Kitty Hawk. She herself was a pioneer aviator. And so it ended up being, we don't really know that much about her early life. We know that she ended up being a newspaper columnist for the New York Herald Tribune beginning in the 20s. Before then, actually, interestingly enough, she had worked as a secretary for the artist Gutzon Borglum, who's best known for carving Mount Rushmore. And I sort of suspect may have had some influence on the Fountainhead, for example. She ended up being a newspaper columnist and a novelist, short story writer. Rose Wilder Lane, she was also born in 1886 and also on the frontier. She was, of course, the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, and later became the secret co-author of the Little House on the Prairie books. But she hated the prairie, and she tried to get away from the prairie as quickly and as far as she could get. She moved to Albania to get away from the prairie, which is about as far away as you can go before you start coming back. And she started out her life as a socialist. She said she was a communist when she was young. And traveling through Eastern Europe as a reporter kind of disabused her of any collectivist political ideas that she may have had. And she returned to the United States just in time for the Great Depression and became a defender of individual liberty in opposition to the New Deal. And of course, Ayn Rand was born in Russia, witnessed the Soviet Revolution, escaped the Soviet Union in the 20s to the United States with dreams of becoming a Hollywood screenwriter and a novelist. And she ended up going to New York and meeting Isabel Patterson in 1940. Now, Patterson and Lane, they had known each other either as pen pals or in person from the 1920s. But Rand didn't meet Patterson until about 1940. But either way, Patterson became kind of a teacher to both of them, and both Rose Wilder Lane and Ayn Rand regarded Patterson as the first among equals of their partnership.
So one of the very fascinating things about your book is, although you focus on these three, and I think you actually put it this way in the book somewhere, it's sort of like a biography of these three books. But you look at a lot of other characters. You have this huge cast of characters in this book. And in fact, one of the things that I found interesting was your table of contents and the chapter titles. So I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through some of these chapter titles and talk to me about who these are referring to give people an idea of sort of breadth of scope of this book.
Yes, I'm glad you noticed that. So I'll admit that I kind of stole that idea from one of my favorite books, a book called The Metaphysical Club by Louis Menand, which is an intellectual history of the philosophy of pragmatism, and just a marvelous book, won the Pulitzer Prize about 23 years ago. And he titled his chapters after sort of nicknames for the characters. And I thought that's kind of a clever device. So, for example, Rose Wilder Lane became fascinated early on with the myth of the wandering Jew, who, according to mythology, was a Jewish man who cursed Jesus when he was hanging from the cross, and as a result was himself cursed to wander the earth without a home. And when Lane heard this story as a young child, she said, she shocked her family by saying that she wished she could be cursed the same way, because she wanted to travel and see the world. So The Wandering Jew is the title of one of my chapters about Lane. The Refugee, of course, is Rand herself, who escaped the Soviet Union. The Bookworm is that was the title of Patterson's newspaper column in the Herald Tribune, which was, by the way, it was not a book review column. It was really more of a gossip column about the publishing industry. It was called Turns with a Bookworm. She was kind of embarrassed. She thought it was a cliched title, but it really stuck. And so that's the title that I used for the chapter about her. The dictator, of course, is Franklin Roosevelt, because Roosevelt really was the closest thing that this country has so far come to a dictator. And people really underestimate how, when he was elected president, there was a real fashion, a vogue for dictatorship in this country. And when he was elected, a lot of people celebrated his election because they hoped he would become a dictator. One of these, for example, was William Randolph Hearst, the incredibly influential newspaper publisher. And by the way, probably one of the most malignant influences on American culture throughout our entire history, who ended up becoming kind of the model for the character of Gale Winand in the Fountainhead. So the titles of the chapters are kind of my characterizations of some of the people that I talk about in the book.
You also break it down into three sections, and the first two I really want to dig into. So the first is the Revolt from the Village. And you've mentioned some of the characters now, some of the cast of this big story that you're telling. Could you talk about a bit about the Revolt from the Village and who spearheaded that?
Yeah, the Revolt from the Village was a term that was used to describe a cultural movement, a literary movement that started really in the late 1910s, but really took off in 1920 with the publication of Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, which is really the greatest of all of the Revolt from the Village novels. And the idea was that previously there were these writers like Mark Twain, who describes the American small town in this very benevolent sort of way that, yeah, it had life in small town America had its troubles, but it still was charming and sweet. Well, this new generation had a much darker perspective on what life was like in the American small town. Now, remember, 1920 is the first US census that finds more Americans living off of farms than on them. So that's a huge transition for American society. It was primarily agricultural. Now it's becoming primarily urban. There's also these immense technological changes, primarily the automobile, but also the radio and all these other technologies, airplanes and so forth. And of course, the huge upheaval of World War I. So between, say, 1890 and 1925, you have a truly radical shift in American society at that time, which is something that I think we tend to underestimate because we're looking back from our own perspective. Anyway, the revolt from the village represented this youthful generation escaping from the small town and talking about how terrible it was. And what Lewis did in Main Street. Now, Main Street, a lot of people today, I don't think they read Sinclair Lewis as much, but he was enormously influential. I think the most important American writer after Mark Twain's death. And we keep rewriting Main Street in today's culture without even realizing it. A while back, I saw the movie called Revolutionary Road, which is just a complete remake of Main Street in today's society. It's about how boring and stupid and stifling small town America is. And the main character of Main Street is a woman who wants a life of significance and meaning. And she's constantly frustrated by how all of her neighbors are so small in their outlook, and they fail to recognize the importance of beauty and truth. And of course, gradually she gets more or less, her psychology becomes broken down, and she ends the novel giving up on a life of meaning. And I think that spoke to a lot of people, especially women in 1920, who wanted something meaningful in their lives. And unfortunately, many of them, by the way, were drawn by that towards things like communism and socialism because it promised to give their lives some sort of significance beyond the small village. Anyway, that's what the Revolt from the Village is. It's a literary movement that has been largely forgotten today, but was hugely influential on all writers, but including the three writers that I talk about in the book.
How did we go from a culture that was interested in Mark Twain? I mean, Mark Twain, you mentioned one of the greatest American writers. William Faulkner said that he was the father of American literature. But then you have Isabel Patterson saying that with Sinclair Lewis, American literature became competently autonomous, I think she put it. What you mentioned briefly, Marx, Darwin, Nietzsche. How do we go from a culture that looks up to a writer like Twain to one that looks up to a writer like Sinclair Lewis?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you latched onto that Patterson comment, because I disagree with her about that. I think when you look at literary history, you're constantly finding critics who say, well, now American literature is truly autonomous. We have our own literature. And they say it every few years. So I don't really buy that. I think Mark Twain is a breakthrough for American literature and is truly a native phenomenon. So I disagree with Patterson on that. But it is true that Lewis was a hugely influential figure in the development of literary realism, or what we now, he crosses over from realism into what we would call naturalism, an attempt to describe life as it is, rather than to talk about how life ought to be, or about going from a literature of choices, which is what Romanticism is, to a literature of status or of society, social description, which is what realism started out to be and turned into naturalism. And you see this in writers like Lewis, but also Sherwood Anderson and others of the time. And I think Marx, Darwin, Freud, Nietzsche, I think these were influences on the intellectuals of the time and definitely affected that. But we shouldn't overestimate their influence. And just in the past couple months, there's an economic historian named Phil Magnus who's published a really interesting and important article about how little influence Marx originally had in the world until the Soviet Union started subsidizing Marx and reprinting and spreading his writings beginning after the Soviet Revolution. In the 1890s, when Isabel Patterson, Rose Wilder Lane were growing up, Marx is not that big an influence. It's not until a couple of years later that really starts to happen. So we shouldn't overestimate that. I think what really happens is the technological revolution is a huge part of it. I think we start to get away from the idea of society as being this hierarchy and stability. And instead we start looking toward a future where we're doing things like building skyscrapers and airplanes. And that leaves a lot of people feeling frustrated because they want that kind of life and they don't have it. And there's this sort of agitation in that direction. That's kind of speculation on my part, because there's as many reasons for this as there are people who experienced it, right? But I think that's a large part of it, was this technological transformation at the time.
And the technological transformation, perhaps not everybody really liked that, and not everybody wants to be part of that, right? So there's, of course, the Romantic movement, and I'm wondering how that spills into this sort of pool of different influences on these writers.
Yeah, not just writers. Actually, now that we're talking about the subject, a figure who comes to mind in the forefront, who I didn't have time to talk that much about in the book, is Frank Lloyd Wright. So Frank Lloyd Wright is really an interesting sort of transitional figure to talk about these subjects, because he lived for such a long time, right? He's born in 1867. He dies in 1959. So he is a hugely influential architect and artist. And he comes into architecture at a time when architects are trying to build houses that turn away from the machine. And I'm thinking of the craftsmen, the Green and Green, who build the Gamble House in Pasadena, that is best known from being Doc Brown's house in Back to the Future. That house, what it's supposed to represent, is getting away from the machine and having an authentic kind of self that's rooted in the earth, and it's all wood and stone and glass, and we're not going to have a machine. On the other hand, you have these real extreme artists on the opposite side, people like Le Corbusier, who say a house is a machine for living. It is a machine, and he's very strict about the idea that our houses should be these incredibly square, no ornamentation, very simple, that sort of thing. Frank Lloyd Wright, he comes out and he actually gives a lecture in Chicago called something like "Living in the Age of the Machine." I forgot the title of it at the moment. Very interesting essay or speech, because he says we shouldn't put away the machine. We shouldn't reject the machine. We should use it for human purposes. We should find a way that we can be authentic with the machine, that we can be human even with the machine in our lives, whether it's the automobile or the skyscraper or what have you. And it's kind of a distinctively American twist on this debate that's going on throughout society at that time. I think that's also reflected in the literature of the time. Is Rand, she has this very romanticized vision. She's very much a romantic. She believes very strongly in a life of significance and meaning and vaunting ambition. Whereas other writers at the time, they want to get away from that, and they want to have a literature that's about, celebrates what we call bourgeois virtues. That is a simple house, with a picket fence and your dog and your wife and your kids and that's it, right? And Patterson, interestingly enough, she's kind of on the bourgeois side of that. She's okay with that. Rand, what she does, though, which is really unique, is she tries to romanticize bourgeois life. So she says, we don't have to get rid of heroism in the modern day of technological mass production. There is a heroism in productivity, and we should celebrate the heroism of building skyscrapers and airplanes and things like that. And she's very unique in that regard. There's really not many writers who have done that.
Yeah, I should mention that today is February 2nd. It's actually Rand's birthday, so it's a fitting day to be talking about this stuff. And one of the things that actually stuck out to me is in your book, you talk about, I think, Patterson saying something to the effect that, oh, we need a writer who romanticizes technology and business and development and production. And then along comes this Russian emigre who says, I can do that. Do you think that they had conversations about this before Rand really dug in with that project?
Well, they certainly did have conversations about it, and you're right. This was one of my favorite discoveries in writing the book, was this article that Patterson wrote in the 1920s, almost 20 years before she met Rand, where she's writing about why are there so few businessmen in fiction? Why do our novels not celebrate businessmen? And she can find very few exceptions to this rule. Well, here we are 100 years later, and we still have hardly any literature that celebrates businessmen. But anyway, she says in that article, in one passage, she says, well, on one hand, she says it's understandable because it would be awfully hard to write a novel about an architect building a skyscraper. How could you do that, right? Which I think is kind of funny, because actually, I'll tell you a little personal story. The way I discovered Ayn Rand's work actually was through the movie The Fountainhead. I was in high school at the time, and I remember I was flipping through the channels one day on TV, and I came across, Cinemax or AMC or something, and they said, coming up next, a movie about an architect who challenges the status quo. And I very much remember thinking to myself, how do you make a movie about an architect? Wouldn't it just be somebody drawing all day? And by the end of the movie, I'm like, wow, this is really neat. Anyway, so that was in the 1920s that Patterson said that. And then, like you said, in 1940 is when they first meet in person. And Rand kind of becomes Patterson's student, learning about economics and constitutionalism and American politics, that sort of thing, primarily. They stay up late at night having this sort of philosophical bull sessions and talking about the books they're working on. Rand is nearing completion of the Fountainhead. Now, the reason I don't say that Patterson had this extremely influential effect on Rand, it wasn't like she gave Rand the idea of writing about an architect. Rand had already pretty much sketched out what she wanted to do with the Fountainhead by that time. In 1938, Rand probably went to see a display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York that was displaying the first photographs of Frank Lloyd Wright's house, Fallingwater, in Pennsylvania, which Rand just loved. And that was before she met Patterson. So she had the architecture idea well along before they met, but it certainly cannot have hurt that Patterson and Rand were talking about these ideas. And I suspect, I mentioned the Guts and Borglum thing. I have the suspicion, it's pure speculation on my part, can't prove it, but there's this story that Guts and Borglum was working on Stone Mountain in Georgia, which he got so frustrated by all the political infighting by the foundation responsible and by the state government that kept interfering with his work, that finally one day he hacked to pieces the model of the sculpture that he had built in his studio and threw the pieces from the top of the mountain and stormed out of the state and refused to do the work. And in fact, Stone Mountain was ultimately carved by somebody else. And Patterson loved this story. She liked to share this story with people. And I suspect that she must have told Rand, you know, I come from a day when men were men, which was a favorite saying of hers. And I can envision a conversation along these lines, and Rand thinking, you know, maybe I'll have my architect blow up a housing tract, you know. But again, that's just speculation on my part.
So another interesting connection is that Rand credits her sort of discovery of the idea that she came to call second-handedness to this conversation that she had at the RKO wardrobe department when she was working in Hollywood. But one of the things that I saw in your book was a sort of anticipation of this idea in Sinclair Lewis's works. And I'm just wondering, do you suspect that she got part of this idea or sort of an inkling of it from him?
It is possible, yeah. I think that Lewis's Babbitt, which was one of his follow-ups to Main Street, I think it was 1924, I think is when it came out. Babbitt is this portrayal of a truly second-handed person, a person who truly has hardly any inkling of an independent personality at all. All of his ideas and beliefs and actions are basically drawn from other people. The only exception is there's one brief moment in the novel when he talks to a friend who's a lawyer, a liberal activist lawyer, like an ACLU guy, and he sort of persuades Babbitt to kind of agree with his political views. And for a little while, Babbitt believes these things, but as pretty soon other people, conservatives, start to pressure him and he gives in and surrenders the brief moment of belief that he had. I do think that Babbitt and other books like it, because there's a similar characters throughout Lewis's writings. I do think that had some influence on Rand. Another example would be Aerosmith, which was another novel that Lewis wrote about, and this was his effort at heroism, kind of. It's a novel about a doctor who tries to find a cure for a disease, but gets influenced by other people in such a way that he ends up abandoning the experiment. But he does so in a way that he gets praised for it. And everybody celebrates him and thinks he's a great guy. And he feels inwardly grotesque at getting praised for doing this thing. And so he abandons his laboratory and moves away to a rural farm and conducts his research in private to get away from people. That was really the closest Lewis ever got to trying to describe a true individualist. And it really was a very pessimistic view that you can't be an individualist around other people. And I think in some ways, Rand is trying to answer that. She's in the Fountainhead, she's trying to provide a response to that. I think one of the most interesting parallels between Rand's work and Lewis's work is the character of Dominique in the Fountainhead, who I think is sort of a ramped up version of the main character in Main Street, Carol Kennicott. Took that character and just, on steroids. That's Dominique in the Fountainhead. She's so disgusted and feels so let down by the failures of promised heroism that turn out to be just paper mache copies, that she finally decides that she will not desire anything. She tries to get rid of her capacity to desire. which incidentally is kind of a throwback to Rand's first novel, We the Living, where the capacity to desire is kind of the first spark of our individualism. It's what makes us distinct and important. And there's an interesting exchange about that in that novel. So Dominique is like this character out of a Sinclair Lewis novel, and Rand is answering Lewis and saying, no, heroism is possible, success is achievable, happiness is a goal that we can realistically hope for if we have integrity enough to insist upon it.
Very interesting. And in a sense, would you say she was also answering in a different way, answering Nietzsche on the integrity point? I think they would both agree. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there is a degree to which the Fountainhead is Rand wrestling with Nietzsche, who had an influence on her in her younger years. And she was still trying to reconcile that, her early influence with Nietzsche, with her views on individual liberty, democracy, and romanticism in her as she grew up. And I think that does underlie attention. And of course, that's the Gail Wynand Howard Rourke dynamic in the novel. Wynand is someone, as I mentioned, heavily modeled on William Randolph Hearst, who has a sort of Nietzschean attitude that the only way you can possibly survive or not end up a victim of the mob is to rule the mob. It's either or in Gail Wynand and Nietzsche's view. And Howard Rourke, his answer is no, just don't let them have any control over your life. Don't let them dictate who you are or how you live.
So we talked a lot about the sort of literary influence on the Three Furies. And could we talk a bit about The Forgotten Man, the sort of second big section, the second big piece of the context that these three novelists and writers shared?
Yeah. So in addition to talking about the literary influences on them, I wanted to talk about the political influences, of course, and that was dominated by Franklin Roosevelt, who was president for 12 years and whose control over the American economy and American society was extremely pervasive, much to a degree that we have largely forgotten, thanks to a historiography profession which has in many ways purposely neglected this history. The true history of the Great Depression is what they today like to call erased history, thanks to the fact that most history professors prefer not to actually talk about what happened in this country during the New Deal. And Franklin Roosevelt's control over things like the media, for example. Roosevelt, during his presidency, the Federal Communications Act was passed, and it required radio stations to obtain a federal government license every 6 months. Every 6 months. And the Federal Communications Commission was entirely appointed by Franklin Roosevelt. And so if you own a radio station, you're not going to allow criticism of the president on the air because you won't get your license, right? And so that sort of control over the media, combined with Roosevelt's incredibly pervasive control over the economy, like enormous masses of people are on the government payroll. They were unemployed. That's why you had a depression. So the solution is you hire them onto the government payroll and you pay them with taxpayer dollars. Well, they're going to be loyal to the government after that, right? And so you have really, he excludes any effective political opposition over the course of this 12 years. Patterson said that his reelection would be the first election funded with votes funded entirely by the American taxpayer. So that pervasive, growing government control over society persuaded all three, Patterson, Lane, and Rand, that America may very well be facing not just its own destruction, but the destruction of all civilization. And that sounds like a real exaggeration in retrospect. But remember that Lane and Patterson were born in 1886. They remembered the Industrial Revolution. These were people who had lived at the speed of the horse. They had lived in a world lit only by fire. They knew what it was like to have a society without the benefits of technology. And they saw in Europe, Germany and the Soviet Union and Italy descending into that same kind of retrogression. And there was no reason in the world why it couldn't happen here. And so they were very afraid, especially in 1940 and 1944, that Roosevelt as president could his government strangulation of the economy might very well spell the end of technological, economic, and social progress in this country, and with good reason.
And So let's talk about some of the specific acts, for instance, that FDR put in place. You mentioned, his control of radio. I know you also talk a bit about the Sedition Act in the book and
Yeah.
the number of people that were affected by that. Could you talk a bit about that act?
Yeah, so the Sedition Act, there was a Sedition Act in 1914, I think, in 1917 rather, during World War I, which both Lane and Patterson can remember, particularly Patterson. Now, we don't really know what Patterson did during World War I, but we do know she later said that she almost had a nervous breakdown because she was so upset about what was happening in the country. And one of those big things was military conscription. She loathed the idea of a military draft. And of course, the government drafted hundreds of thousands, if not of millions of Americans into the military in World War I. And now here comes World War II, and it's going to happen again. Not just happen again, but of the nation's first peacetime military draft in 1940. So Patterson is particularly incensed about this, but the government also passes a Sedition Act that makes it illegal to criticize the military draft or to speak out in a way that might deter people from entering the military. I think that's the phrase that was used in the act. And this is a real threat of prosecution against writers and thinkers, and it's used against a lot of prominent intellectuals of the day. Everyone from H.L. Mencken to Franklin Roosevelt or to Franklin Wright are being followed by the FBI. The FBI, in fact, investigates Rose Wilder Lane when she writes a postcard to a radio station in which she expresses her opposition to Social Security. The FBI shows up at her door, so they're not wrong to be worried about the penalties for sedition. And yet Patterson still has the guts to go out in her newspaper column and oppose the military draft. Now, she does so wisely. She says things like, there's one line where she says something like, well, we can't speak out about what we really think about the draft because it would end us up in jail, and so she's doing her best to speak out against tyranny, but it's difficult. And that, by the way, creates a bias in our history, because now we look back at that time and, well, didn't see a lot of people criticizing things. Yeah, because they weren't allowed to,
Were there any roots of that act? I'm just curious. I know that John Adams passed something called the Sedition Act. Was this sort of just hey, let's revive that and put it back in place, or was this a whole new piece of legislation?
It was a whole new piece of legislation, but there have been more than one Sedition Act in the United States, and the 1917 Sedition Act remains on the books and has been its constitutionality has been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, and that decision is still considered valid law today.
Interesting. So there's a very strong violation of free speech protection right there. You reminded me, when you're talking of Patterson's discussion of the draft, we'll just call it that, since we're not allowed to still not allowed to talk badly about the draft. You reminded me of Lane's support for an act that would require a referendum to allow the U.S. to go to war, and a very interesting response that she drew from Eleanor Roosevelt. Could you tell that story?
Yeah, so this was a proposal right before World War II broke out. Lane was very much against American involvement in the war in Europe after 1939. She thought America should stay out of it. And so did Patterson. And the reason why was because they hated the idea of an alliance with Stalin. The idea of helping Stalin to perpetuate his tyranny, it just disgusted them. And Patterson pointed out that it also was impractical. She thought, why should we do this? The Soviets can't even build a car without stealing the plans from Ford. So what benefit are they to us? If America gets invaded, we can defend ourselves. We don't need to go out there and do Stalin's fighting for him. That was her attitude at the time. So Lane, she decides she's going to actually try and take steps to prevent American involvement in World War II. And so she supports this proposal called the Ludlow Amendment, offered by a congressman whose name was Ludlow, that would have required a national referendum on going to war, with the exception that that would not apply if America was invaded or directly attacked. And the Roosevelt administration tries to ignore it for a long time, but the polling shows that it's really quite popular among the American public. And so finally, Eleanor goes out to debate Rose Wilder Lane in the pages of Liberty magazine, Rose writes this article where she says, here's why we should do this. You know, we know now from the historical record that the Wilson administration lied to this country about World War I and got us involved in that war without legitimate cause, and God forbid it happen again. And Eleanor responds in her article saying, we need the ability to threaten war as a tool of diplomacy. We don't want to be, if we're negotiating with foreign countries and we say, well, you know, if you don't do this, we're going to go to war with you, and that power will be taken away from us. That card will be taken off the table if our enemies know that we can't go to war without a national referendum. Lane responds, well, you know, you shouldn't be able to use that as a tool of diplomacy. That's a dangerous thing. And besides which, remember that this doesn't apply if we're actually attacked, right? So that's the debate that goes on. And Lane ends up going and testifying in Congress, in the US Senate, in support of the Ludlow Amendment, but it ended up going nowhere.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Hearst earlier and being sort of one of the worst influences in American history. Could you talk a bit more about him and especially his influence on Rand? Because as you said, he seems to be a model for one of the main characters in the Fountainhead.
Yeah, in fact, my speculation here, I'm going to speculate again. My speculation is that Rand, when she first got the idea for the Fountainhead, wanted to just write it about Gail Wynan, and that the Howard Roark idea came to her afterwards, is my suspicion. Because she would have been in Hollywood in the 1920s, around the same time that Hearst was getting into the movie business. And I sort of suspect that his name was going around a lot at the time, and that that's what got her interested in Hearst as a personality. So Hearst was an incredibly wealthy man. He was born into a family that owned a major stake in the Comstock lode in Nevada. So, you know, he literally grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth. And he decided, you know, after spending a while as a rich playboy with no purpose in life, his father finally said, here, why don't you run my newspaper? So Hearst takes over this newspaper, and he realizes that the way to succeed in the newspaper business is to take the yellow journalism invented by Joseph Pulitzer and like ramp it up to volume 10. And so his newspapers and his magazines become enormously successful thanks to his ability to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And he does very much what Wynan does in the book. He, you know, runs salacious pictures of scantily clad girls in the slums in his newspapers, because you got the sex appeal, but you also have the sort of moralistic appeal about how bad the slums are. And he figures out how to push all the buttons to be really popular, has no principles of his own. If anything, he's basically a sort of a fascist. His all he has as far as philosophical grounds are concerned is traditionalism. 100% Americanism is basically his thing. He supports Franklin Roosevelt because he's sort of vaguely collectivist and everything. Then Roosevelt comes in and starts implementing the New Deal, and it's bad for business. And Hearst is like, wait a minute, this is like socialism. I didn't like that. You know, it's like the surprise, the scorpion stung you. How shocking. So he tries to turn around and become an anti-Franklin Roosevelt figure around 1936 and starts attacking the New Deal. But by that time, Roosevelt's in power, and he does things like unleash the IRS against Hearst and things. And Hearst winds up essentially bankrupt and ends up being destroyed, mostly by his poor finances, but largely also by the hostility with which his anti-Roosevelt position is taken. He had nurtured the Roosevelt left for a long time, and then when he tried to oppose it, they turned against him. In the Fountainhead, there's a passage where when Wynan tries to take a stand in favor of Howard Roark, people protest at his newspaper, and they're wearing buttons that say, "We don't read Wynan." Well, that actually happened. Hearst was protested by people who wore buttons that said, "We don't read Hearst," and so forth. So Hearst tried at the last minute to resist Roosevelt, but by that time he had sold his soul to the devil so much for such a long time. And he's really, I mean, this is a man who gave Benito Mussolini a weekly column in his newspaper. So he's a horrible character and really an irredeemable human being in my view. But Rand, the reason Rand's interested in him is not because of that primarily. She's interested because on one hand, he's this massive industrial titan who has succeeded in building something that really is remarkable and beautiful, which is this massive media empire that he's succeeded in accomplishing all by himself, you know, in that sense. And so in that sense, it's an individualist story. But on the other hand, he's this appealing to the lowest common denominator, fascism, and all that. So there's this bizarre tension about his character. And I think that really fascinated Rand. And of course, that's a major part of the Fountainhead, is that tension in Gale Winans' own soul that Rourke is able to sort of pry apart and say, here's live the better live all the freer with the better half of your soul, or whatever it is that Hamlet says. That's what motivates that. That, by the way, I should add, is also there's also an aspect of Gale Winan that is Isabel Patterson. Rand's friendship with Patterson in the 40s, I think, is reflected in Winan's friendship with Howard Rourke in the novel.
Yeah. You mentioned Hearst's pragmatism, and I wonder to what extent any of the Furies sort of had either a false idea of pragmatism or actually a correct idea of pragmatism and adopted it to some extent. And I ask because there's a quote in your book where Lane says, "The basis of American morality is a practical attitude toward concrete facts," she wrote. "God came with the pioneers to a new continent, teaching the American people that morality is the best policy, and individualism of the pioneer America can transform the primitive communism in which human society began into an abundant and well-structured life." There's another place where she says more, she actually uses the word pragmatism to describe American morality as well.
Yeah, Lane's philosophical views, I think, are kind of, she like Patterson is very much self-taught. She had a little bit more of education than Patterson, but not much. Neither of them went to college. Lane completed high school, but neither of them were scholars in that sense. They were self-taught when it came to philosophy. And Lane really went back and forth about philosophical ideas and was heavily influenced by religion early on. And I think that when she's talking about pragmatism, there's two things going on. One is that as a young woman in her youth, pragmatism was very much assumed to be the American contribution to philosophy. And so that may be why she sort of defaulted to saying pragmatism was American philosophy. But she also, I think, was groping toward the idea of how American individualism is distinct, how it was generated, in her view, by the frontier experience. And she's responding, of course, to writers like Charles Beard, the historian who was trying to characterize American development and American history as the outcome of economic forces in class, or as Lane put it, classes and masses. And she's trying to respond to that in terms of how people learned individualism on the American frontier. Obviously, it wasn't from textbooks. It was from their own personal experience in trying to earn a living in a harsh environment. And I think that's what she's trying to get at. But Lane would have been the first to admit that she was not, a philosophical scholar, and she really struggled with some of these ideas in these long, rambling philosophical letters, including some back and forth to Rand about individualism and life on the frontier. But I don't think that Lane could be fairly described as a pragmatist in the technical philosophical sense. She's really more it's kind of strange. It's kind of a combination of materialism and religion. She says she doesn't believe in mysticism. She doesn't believe in some kind of spiritual essence. She thinks that things like economic liberty, the laws of economics or the laws of morality, are real things in the real world. But she seems to think that they're sort of like emanations from some sort of order-giving authority kind of thing. Anyway, it's hard to describe because she kind of was very vague in her own discussions of this, and she never really concretized them into a final work. Her great book, The Discovery of Freedom, is really just about politics. And later in life, when she tried to turn it into a more philosophical treatise, she never completed it. So we don't really know her final thoughts on those kinds of questions.
So we know a bit about what the Furies agreed upon. Could you talk a little bit more about what they disagreed on?
Yeah, and that's a good transition because Lane's religious views were, of course, part of her differences with Rand. So Rand and Lane met in person only one time. And apparently their conversation turned to religion at some point. Now, Lane told this story 15 years later to Jasper Crane, who was a devoutly religious businessman. And so she was probably sort of tilting the story in the direction of religion. According to her, they talked about religion and argued about where God comes from. She said, well, order has to come from God. And apparently Rand said, well, then where does God come from? And Lane said, this is a stupid question. But she didn't tell us how she answered it, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, so Lane claimed that they argued about religion and never spoke again. And that's not really what happened. Apparently, Lane had a great time in the conversation and wrote her a letter the next day saying, please come back. I really enjoyed our conversation. So religion was part of their ideological differences. With Patterson, religion was also part of it, but it was more a personality problem. Patterson had I think, a streak of depression. She tended to be very abrasive, and she had a very short temper. And she was particularly angry at the way businessmen refused to stand up for their rights. It really bothered her. And so she wanted, at one point later in her career, she wanted to start up a magazine, a free market magazine. And Rand was trying to help her out by introducing her to wealthy businessmen who might be able to provide capital. And Patterson would just offend these, just insult them to their faces by saying things like, why don't you do more to fight the government? And you're taking subsidies from the government, all this sort of thing. And the meetings would break down. And it got worse and worse, particularly toward the end of her life, when one of Patterson's closest friends committed suicide, which I think contributed to the depression. And Patterson's behavior got to the point where Rand just could not be close to her anymore. They remained cordial to the end of their lives, but she just couldn't be close to her. So the differences were less ideological, although there was that, than personal, really.
And they, of course, the three of them had major ideological differences with some of the other people that could have been friendly parties, right? So you mentioned businessmen not standing up for freedom and not really helping to fund this magazine. What set them apart from some of the other people that perhaps were trying to defend freedom?
Well, here I'll use the best example of this would be Friedrich Hayek. So Friedrich Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, comes out in 1944, the year after all three of these women published their books. And Hayek's book, an argument that if you start regulating one part of the economy, eventually everything's going to get regulated, and pretty soon, you're on the road to serfdom. And it's a good observation, and a lot of Hayek's observations are interesting and useful ideas about economics. But he doesn't make a moral argument for liberty. He doesn't say you have a moral right to be free. On the contrary, he seems to accept a sort of, you might say, pragmatism, or a sort of a collectivist view that the individual consciousness is a creation of his cultural milieu, and that individualism can be legitimately limited. He uses the term circumscribed, even if it's circumscribed quite narrowly. He says the individual still is free. Well, no, it seems to suggest that it's okay for the government to circumscribe individual rights, and the word rights never even appears in the book. And I think Rand and Lane specifically, Patterson doesn't seem to have read Hayek, but Lane and Patterson were really bothered by this. Lane wrote a review of the book for a magazine called the New Economic Council Review of Books that she edited. And she said, this is like a doctor saying that you can take a 10% shot of syphilis and still be healthy. Because Hayek says, well, you can still have a little bit of a welfare state and still have capitalism, and really bothers Lane. And of course, Rand is particularly bothered by his refusal to endorse a moral and consistent case for liberty as a first principle. Hayek wrote this famous essay called Why I Am Not a Conservative. But the reality is that he was. Hayek was really more of your Burkean type of conservative. And all of his arguments basically boil down to the idea of be careful, which is, okay, that's good advice, but it doesn't really tell you what is the legitimate role of government, and what rights I as a human being have, and how I should aspire to design my life, and things like that. And those are the things that Rand and Lane thought were much more important. So That was a huge part of their problem with the emerging free market movement at the time. They also had some problems with other writers like Mises and Henry Hazlitt. Mises, in particular, Mises was a true moral relativist. He thought there was no objectivity to morality, that whatever the majority believes is right is just by definition right, which Rand thought was obviously wrong, and yet she thought it wasn't really central to what Mises wrote, so you could just ignore that and still enjoy Mises. But it really bothered Lane, and Lane wrote this review where she said of A Human Action, where she said this part is just completely wrong. And later on, she had the chance to correspond with Mises, and Mises said that he refused to speak to somebody who said that all of his work was wrong. And Lane tried to talk to him about it, and Mises wrote back, I know none of my theories are accepted by all of you ex-communists. So they did not get along very well.
And what's interesting is none of the three Furies had a PhD. I mean, Rand was college educated, but the only one among the three. Yet you point in several places in the book to economic theories that Hayek and Mises would later sort of formalize, that they in some sense anticipated. You talk a little bit about their prescience on the economic matters.
And it's true that Mises and Hayek were working with a body of knowledge at the time that, but that was in German in Europe. And it's not, Lane and Rand and Patterson were not reading German economic journals. So they came to these ideas on their own, and particularly ideas such as spontaneous order is the term that we use for Hayek's insight on how you can have an economic order without somebody coming in and designing it. And Lane, for example, in a marvelous little book that she published in 1936 called Credo, it's less than 100 pages long, she talks about these ideas and anticipates some of Hayek's insights. And my favorite part is she talks about how she uses an analogy. She says, compare how a classroom operates with how we leave a theater. In a classroom, order is maintained by the teacher because the teacher is in charge and the students are there to do what she says. And so the teacher is saying, do this, do that. And the reason why is because they're kids and they aren't fully in charge of their faculties. They're there to do what the teacher says. Obedience and discipline are the order of the day. Whereas in a theater, when the movie's over and we're leaving a theater, there's nobody in charge. Nobody stands up on stage and says, okay, now row one. Okay, now row two. People just find their way out of the theater.
Only airplanes.
And yet right. And we make, a modern example might be to compare Southwest Airlines boarding policy with the boarding policy of American or United or something, where you have an assigned seat and you board in groups. Southwest Airlines boards its planes 10 minutes faster than any other airline. And the reason is because of the spontaneous order that when you get on, you select your own seat and people figure these things out for themselves. And it cuts down a third of the boarding time. It takes a half an hour to board these planes. Southwest does it in 20 minutes because of that spontaneous order insight. So Lane's example of the theater versus the classroom is revealing, both because, it's a beautiful example of what Hayek would later call spontaneous order, the theater, that we can reach the sidewalk without somebody telling us where to go. But it's also an insight into the moral aspect of it, which is that in the teacher example, there's somebody telling you what to do. And in the theater example, there's not. And so Lane, at that point in the argument, Lane would interject that you have a right to live your own life because it belongs to you. And there, I'll say, I think Lane's greatest philosophical insight, and the part that I like most about her writing, is what she calls the fact of individualism. And she very much stresses this in her writing, that individualism is a fact of nature. It is not a tradition. It's not a preference. It's not a value judgment. It's not a historical inheritance or anything like that. The fact that I run my own life is a fact of reality. I can't think for another person. I can't believe for another person. I can't give somebody else my education or my musical tastes. I can't breathe for another person. Ultimately, I have to be in charge of my life. And that is inalienable. That's what the Declaration of Independence means when it says our rights are inalienable. They cannot be separated from us. And that's really important because in today's political world, we tend to talk about these things as in terms of relativism of, well, some societies have freedom and some societies don't. And well, it depends on what you think is best and all this sort of thing. Lane says there is no symmetry here. It's asymmetrical. On one side, there's a society of control and authoritarianism and collectivism and starvation. And on the other side, there's the fact of reality that each individual is ultimately in charge of his or her own life, which means that if you try to implement a bureaucracy, you are ending up with some people bossing people around and ultimately with them beating other people and shooting other people and jailing other people. Of course, Rand agreed with that, but I just really like the way that Lane puts it in The Discovery of Freedom.
Mm-hmm. So that's an amazing insight. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the greatest insights of the other two.
Well, Patterson's brilliance in The God of the Machine. Now, The God of the Machine is not an easy book to read. It was Patterson's only attempt at nonfiction, and it has some marvelously readable moments, but it also has some chunks that you kind of reread a couple times to quite get what she's at. And her argument is that the economy is not like a machine. The economy truly is a machine, or she puts it, a circuit of energy, not as a metaphor, not as an analogy, but actually it is a mechanism by which energy is transformed into different forms. For example, we take fuel and we use that to till a field to grow corn. The corn is now food energy that we've transformed the fuel into that kind of energy now. Now I consume the food and I go and I write out an equation that allows me to split the atom. What I've done is I've taken the energy from the food that was grown and I've transformed that into a new kind of energy, which is the splitting the atom and releasing new kinds of energy. So Patterson is very much arguing in mechanistic thermodynamic terms. I think that's really quite brilliant. There's one little thing wrong with it, which is that the economy is not actually a machine. The economy is much more like an ecosystem. It's grown, it's not made. An economy is more like a jungle than it is like an engine or an electronic circuit. And Patterson is on the right track, but I think if she were working today, she would instead use a biological example. And I think Rand would have pointed this out, would have said, well, you know, there's a disanalogy whenever you try to talk about human philosophy and you use metaphors drawn from the mechanistic world where things cannot be created or destroyed. You have to keep that difference in mind. Rand's single greatest insight, boy, that would be tough, because I think her philosophy has a lot of very rich insights. I think, and she would have argued that they all derive logically from the idea that reality is what it is and not some other thing. But I really, what I most appreciate about Rand's writing is her respect for the individual's right to pursue his or her own happiness. A while back, I saw on Twitter somebody was doing say your philosophy in 5 words. And to me, Rand's philosophy in 5 words is my life is my own. And I think that's a beautiful idea, and the one that I probably most appreciate from her work.
Inevitably, in writing, even, you know, this book is a little over 400 pages in the version that I've got. And even a book of that length, when you talk about such a breadth of time and of intellect, you have to leave some things out. So I'm wondering, what were some of the things that you didn't get to talk about in the book, but that you think are pretty important, perhaps formative influences on the Furies, or parts of the context that people often sort of forget about?
Well, there's a few things that immediately come to mind. I wish I had had more time to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright. I wish I had had more time to talk about William Randolph Hearst. I wish that I had had time to talk about Willa Cather. She was a writer who, a little bit earlier, she was writing around 1910, 1915, and she was one of these early village rebel writers. She wrote a book that I actually she wrote a number of novels that are known as the Prairie Trilogy, My Antonia, which was one of Isabel Patterson's very favorite novels. And actually there's a Rand story there. When they first met, when Patterson and Rand first met at the office at the New York Herald Tribune, they were sitting around, Patterson and Rand and Patterson's best friend, Will Cuppy, who I mentioned later committed suicide. And they were talking about Russia and America. And Cuppy made a joke. He said, "Well, I understand in Russia, when you go around in sleds all day in the snow, being pursued by wolves, and why don't you bring extra people along with you on the sleds, and you can toss them to the wolves so you can get away?" Which was a little reference to My Antonia, where there's actually a passage in that book where that happens. And Rand said that she replied that she had never known any actual Russian sleigh to be actually pursued by wolves, but that as a young woman growing up in Russia, she, of course, had heard all about Americans being tomahawked by Indians. And Patterson, who had actually grown up near Indians on the American frontier, said that although she had grown up near Blackfoot ceremonies on the Western Plains, she had never actually known anybody to be tomahawked. So anyway, Cather's novels, the Pioneer trilogy, I just recently read the third novel of that, which is Song of the Lark. And what a marvelous novel. I would really encourage anybody out there who likes this kind of literature, likes Rand and Lane, I would encourage you to check out Song of the Lark. It's a story about a girl growing up in a small Western town on the plains who turns out is a really good singer. And she becomes, over the course of the novel, a famous opera singer in New York. And she's a very interesting character. She's pursued by several men in the novel, and she has to deal with balancing a career and love, and she chooses the career. And it's a lyrical novel that spends a lot of time reflecting on the beauties of the American frontier, but also on the bad things in small town life. And I would have been fascinated to hear what Rand would have thought of this novel, because it has some passages that are really parallel to Rand's belief in heroism and success, but it also has sort of this nostalgic quality about the small town. And it really fits into sort of the revolt from the village aspect, but in a much richer way. It's not strident the way Sinclair Lewis was. So I wish I had space to get into things like that. But as you said, 400 pages, you got to leave something out.
Yeah, I heard that F. Scott Fitzgerald sort of opined that The Great Gatsby was no My Antonia. Do we have any?
Really?
Yeah, I did read that.
Well, that's interesting, because it was on Twitter that it was recommended that I check out Song of the Lark, and the person who recommended it said it is the great American novel. And I think that person may be right.
Interesting. Do we have any reason to believe that Rand read any Willa Cather?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay.
Rand was much more interested, of course, she had particular literary interests. Of course, she loved the great romantics, people like Victor Hugo and Edmond Rostand. But she also was really into detective fiction and crime fiction, which, by the way, Patterson really disliked. Their literary tastes were very different. Patterson really did not like the romantics. She did not like romanticism. Her favorite novel was the famous Japanese novel, the Tale of Genji, was her favorite novel, which Rand would have just hated. And so they never really agreed on literature, interestingly enough.
Well, that's kind of interesting, because I know that Rand at some point said that Calumet K by Henry Kitchell Webster was her favorite novel, or
yes,
one of the best.
Yes, absolutely. And that also, I did not get a chance to talk about that in my book. So Calumet K is a novel, very short novel, originally appeared in 1901 in the Saturday Evening Post. And it's a novel about a man who's working to have a grain silo constructed on a deadline. And the story just centers around the challenges he faces, whether it's technological or, he's got a corrupt union officials he has to deal with and all this sort of thing. And there's an element of sort of the seeds of Howard Rourke there. I mean, it's not nearly fleshed out enough to be a true progenitor of Rourke, but there's a little bit of that in there. There's one passage where they're almost done building the grain silo, and a workman comes to the site before his shift has started. And when the main character named Bannon, when he finds out that this man has come to the work site before his shift has started, just because he likes being there, there's a scene in the Fountainhead that's very similar, and I suspect that that's sort of an homage to Calumet K, which Rand she read it because she was considering making a movie This is in her early days in Hollywood. Whether to try and make a movie out of it, which of course never materialized. It's a delightful little read. It's a very short book, but it's really good.
I don't know too much about Henry Kitchell Webster, but it seems that he sort of fit the bill of what it was that Patterson was sort of asking for. We need novels that glorify the industrialist. Do we know if Patterson was familiar with Webster's work?
She never mentions him in her newspaper column. It's possible that there's an article out there or letters or something where she mentioned that it certainly is the sort of thing that she would have been familiar with, that you would expect her to have known. But I am not aware of any direct connection between the two. I would love that, and someday, if I had time, I would like to pursue Webster more and find out more about him as a writer.
So one of the sort of mild criticisms of your book that I've read, I think it was Mark Witcher wrote about, he sort of complained that you didn't take time to comment on the Three Furies' views on racism. And I was wondering if you have thoughts on their views on racism. Did they have any similarities on that count?
All of them were very forward-looking on the issue of racism. Rand, of course, denounced racism famously as the lowest and most primitive form of collectivism in her essay on racism. Patterson wrote some essays that openly denounced racism very early on in her career, at a time when that was, pretty unusual. But it was Lane, of the three, it was Lane who was most outspoken on questions of race. She was really bothered by racism because she thought of Americans as a nationality as meaning that really meant a lot to her. It meant something very significant to her. There's an incident when she was talking to some Jewish friends shortly after the Nazi invasion of Poland, and these friends were saying that they hoped America would get involved in the war, and Lane was opposed to that. And they said to her, "Well, you don't understand. We're Jewish, and so this really matters to us more." And Lane was shocked by this. She writes in her diary, she was really taken aback by this because she said, "Well, they're not there." She says that the Jewish, they're Americans. Shouldn't that take precedence? That sort of idea of nationalism really mattered to her. And so she was very bothered by differentiating between Americans based on race. And she ended up writing a regular column for the Pittsburgh Courier, which was the nation's largest black newspaper at the time, in 1943, the same year that she published The Discovery of Freedom. And she wrote an angry letter to the American Mercury magazine when it ran an article that was vaguely anti-Semitic, which was considered okay back then. And they did that. And she wrote a very angry letter to them denouncing anti-Semitism. So all three of them were certainly opposed to racism. But of the three, I think it was Lane who talked about it most consistently.
If the Furies were alive today, what do you think they would think is sort of the most salient issue, the most pressing thing that we're facing today?
Well, boy, that's a good question. And it would be very hard to narrow it down. I think if you asked Rand, she would say that it's irrationality writ large, but that irrationality manifests itself in various different ways. In politics today, there's this lust for the strong man, this desire for somebody to come in and just implement his will and impose our desires on other people, which is very much what was going on in the 1940s. That was a very popular attitude back then as well. And I think Lane, I suspect that if you asked Lane, she would say that the single thing that probably would bother her most is the lack of knowledge of American history. She would be really bothered by the fact that so few people understand and appreciate the true facts of American history, and that we have these intellectual frauds like the 1619 Project that get all the attention, whereas the true stories of the great accomplishments of Americans and as a result of the American constitutional system and the American mores of individualism, I think she would have been bothered by that ignorance. It's hard to imagine what Patterson would have said. If he would have said, "What's the biggest problem in America today?" I think she would have slammed down the phone and said, "All right, how much time do you have?" She probably would have started with, "American businessmen refuse to stand up for their rights." I think that's what she would say is the biggest problem. As Reagan used to say, businessmen like to feed the alligator in hopes that it will eat them last.
Well, I absolutely loved your book, and I hope people will check it out. Freedom's Furies. It's a thick read, but it's well worth your time. And thank you
And
so
if you don't want, if you don't have the endurance for 400 pages, I will read it to you on audible.com.
Excellent. Well, I can't think of a better person to read it. And I have to say that one other point that came up in Mark Witcher's review, it was that if you're wanting to learn American history and, as economic history of the Great Depression, this is not really just a book about the Three Furies and the books that they published in 1943. It's about the entire context, and there's just a fantastic account of FDR's presidency and actually even Hoover's. And so anyone interested in any of those topics, there's so much value in this book for understanding where we are today and also just understanding how to respond to today's issues. So I can't recommend it enough. And thank you both for writing it and for coming on to talk about it.
Thanks very much, John.